The accusation involved two friends, two very good friends, and our client, the accusation was that he stabbed his very good friend to death in the midst of an argument out in the front yard. I was very fortunate to work with a very good friend of mine, Cara Carreras, and she had felt very strongly about this case from the beginning. She was involved from the case even before it was indicted. She had hoped that the case would not be indicted, that the state would recognize that there were a lot of issues that involved self-defense. However, the state saw it differently and indicted our client. And it was several months when any plea bargaining broke down, or all possibilities of plea bargaining broke down. And she asked me if I would be willing to try the case with her. I knew how strongly she felt about it, and I don't see her feel this kind of passion in most of her cases, but she really, really cared about this client. And when I met him, I completely understood why. And then I joined the team. The incident happened January the 31st of 2023. And interestingly enough, we found ourselves in trial on the second anniversary of the deceased death. And so it took a few days short of 2 years to try the case, and we asked for a special setting. So we were asking for a more expedited trial than we normally receive in court. And so we were in trial on the anniversary, and then we argued it the following Monday. I've often said I may not be the smartest lawyer in the courtroom, and rarely am I the smartest lawyer in the courtroom, but I want to know the case better than any lawyer in the courtroom. And so I feel like I have to make up for that. And I have to compensate by seeing every witness statement. And there was a little bit of a challenge in this case, or a lot of a challenge, because so many of the witnesses spoke Spanish. And so it wasn't as simple as just reading what they said. We had to get it translated and then into English, then memorize what the witnesses said. But in this case as well, there were 14 patrol officers that responded to the scene that night. And every one of those patrol officers has what's called body cam. Every uniformed officer has like a little camera on their uniform, and it captures hours and hours and hours of what they're doing out at the scene, unless they mute their mic. Then there's also their patrol cars that also have audio and potentially video footage. And so we watched hours and hours and hours of body cam and dash cam footage involving this case. And so to kind of give you in a nutshell what happened, on January the 31st, it was the beginning of one of our snowmageddons in Fort Worth. And it was very, very cold. So businesses were beginning to shut down. Schools were beginning to think about whether or not they were going to close. And so this group of friends got together at our client's house. They'd gotten together on countless occasions the year before. They were very close. If there was a weekend, you'd find them together. They all got together, and the deceased and his girlfriend were in a little bit of an argument that night. The deceased girlfriend and our client also, though, loved to dance together. And they'd done so on countless other occasions. So they were all sitting in the kitchen, and they'd been there several hours. They turned on the music, and they were going to dance like they normally do. And for some reason, the deceased broke up the dance midway, shoved his girlfriend and said, "We're gonna go," grabbed her by the arm, and everybody's watching this, not understanding what's happening. And everybody had been drinking, but the deceased especially had had quite a bit to drink. And I think his blood alcohol level was over a 0.2, which is 2.5 times the level that you're legally intoxicated in Texas. But everybody had been drinking, but they couldn't understand why all of a sudden that night this just enraged him. And so he grabbed his girlfriend by the arm, and everybody was like, "Wait a second, she doesn't have to go with you," because they were really worried if he would do that in public, what was he willing to do in private? No one wanted her to leave with him. And so in the course of trying to protect her, the deceased pushed not only his girlfriend, pushed her friend, and then pushed our client's wife out in the front yard. And there was a lot more to it, but in the end, in the moments before his death, our client had his wife in front of him. She was saying, let's just let them go. And they were letting him go. They were saying, "That's fine, go ahead and leave." And then the deceased rushed them. And in so doing, my client protected his wife, shoved his wife out of the way, and pulled his knife. And it was one stab wound, and it was the end of his life. The knife that my client had was just a regular pocket knife that he clipped on his pocket. It was a knife everybody'd seen him with. That was the only knife he had. It was really like a work knife, a practical knife. And it was one of those knives where you hit a button and the blade pops out. And they were very good friends. This was the last thing that my client ever wanted to happen. Now, by way of a little bit of background, what the state did not know, because their witnesses hadn't told them, is that the deceased and his girlfriend, when they were together at night, my client and his wife lived together with them. There were many occasions where they could hear arguments and what sounded to be assaults in the other room. They thought they could hear basically her hitting the wall and her saying, "That hurts me," or "That's hurting me." And she would then text my client's wife to say, "Will you please take me home?" Because she actually had a house at a different location. And then when my client's wife would go to the room to try to take her home, the deceased would not let her leave. And so that happened, I don't know, more than 5 times when they all lived together, and then happened a couple of times leading up to the events of January the 31st. The other thing that the state didn't know is that at a Christmas party in December, that the deceased had actually pushed my client's wife when he got mad at her. And my client had gone up to the deceased and said, "Don't ever put your hands on my wife again." And so there was also that. And then 48 hours before this happened, the deceased was at a quinceañera, of all things, 100 people there. Good time had by everyone. And somehow a phone gets stolen, a cell phone. Not my client's cell phone, not the deceased's cell phone, but the deceased was so upset and offended by this, he went out to his car and armed himself with a machete with an 18-inch blade and put it down the back of his pants. And apparently, he always had a machete with him, either on him or in the back of his car. He always had a steak knife in the driver's door of his car. And so we knew that to know the deceased was to know there was a blade nearby. And the crime scene officers that processed the scene that night, and it's really interesting, the officer that testified, I've known and worked with when I was a prosecutor, and I kind of called him the Yoda of crime scene because he was the all-knowing one and he taught all the younger crime scene officers. And he said, I took 691 pictures at the scene that night. And we asked him, what do you look for? And he's a state's witness, mind you. And he said, I look for the things that don't fit the narrative, which is really how you get to the truth of what happened. Because the fact that somebody died doesn't answer how they died or the circumstances that lead up to it, or whether it's self-defense, whether it's justified under Texas law. We have 691 pictures, and we're going through all of this body cam in preparation for trial. And this was several weeks before we actually started the trial. I'm walking off, and this is in an obscure little piece of body cam. We hear an officer, great officer, very conscientious, very thorough officer say, and he's got a flashlight and he's looking on the ground and he goes, where are those keys? You know, the ones that had the knife on it. And we both stop. Kara and I both stop and we look at each other and we go, did he just say knife? Because that's not our client's knife. That's the deceased's knife. And it's not mentioned anywhere in the report. And so this officer, this very conscientious officer, former Marine, locates the keys. And he gives them to another officer. That officer threw it in the back of his patrol car. Did not collect it, seal it like evidence, but threw it in the back of his patrol car. Forgot about it. Didn't tell the homicide detective. Didn't tell crime scene. Forgot about it for a couple of days. Logged it into evidence. But no one knew. And the family of the deceased came to pick up the keys a few days later. And so it was kind of like, and this is what I told the jury, like that picture in Raiders of the Lost Ark where you have all of the crates and it's long forgotten. So you have 691 pictures of everything except the thing that doesn't fit the narrative. So when the state is presenting their case, I don't think they realize that the deceased was armed with a pocket knife, or with a knife. It's not just a pocket knife. It was somewhat of a menacing looking pocket knife. And so when we took a still from that video and we showed that to the jury, you don't normally see a lot of reaction from jurors, but you could see a very visible jaw drop, so to speak, from a number of the jurors. Well, what I said in closing argument, because the state said a couple of things in opening statement that I thought they don't have the whole picture. And we talked about this case and what the state was presenting as the Instagram version of the case. And we're going to take off the filters and we're going to show you the whole picture. And I don't blame the state. I don't think the state knew. I don't think their witnesses told them the whole picture. They certainly didn't know he was abusive to his girlfriend. They didn't know that he had pushed our client's wife before and that our client had said, don't put your hands on my wife again. They didn't know that 48 hours before this, the deceased had armed himself with a machete over a stolen cell phone at a quinceañera. They didn't know all of that. It's a very obscure part of body cam footage, and I will tell you, in most cases, 99% of the body cam footage means nothing. It does not advance the ball. But you have to watch it because you never know when you're going to find that needle in a haystack. Oh, I'm never confident going into trial. I never take anything for granted. It's not over until a jury signs the verdict, because there could be things that we haven't realized. That wasn't the case, in this situation, but it can be. And I never take anything for granted. You're putting your fate in the hands of 12 strangers. You hope you've made good decisions about who to seat on the jury, but you never know until the end. We had a nurse on the jury. We didn't know how a nurse would feel about seeing the kind of injuries that the deceased sustained in this case, for instance. It's always a risky decision to allow your client to testify. Anything can happen. And you never know how they're going to handle your questions or the state's questions. You just don't know how they're going to do in that moment. It's kind of like watching an Olympian. Everybody can think that they know who's going to win the gold medal and how it's going to play out, and then something happens. A skier trips. They hit a mogul they didn't expect, and they wipe out, and they don't even place. So you never know what's going to happen on the witness stand. I mean, courtrooms are kind of like the Wild West. They're the last of the Wild West. We don't have depositions. We have no idea. It's unscripted, so you don't know what's going to happen. In this case, in particular, it was especially difficult because our client had an 8th grade education from another country. He did not speak the language. And so there were a lot of things that to me could have worked against him. And he was going to be facing questioning by someone who was a skilled trial lawyer who had graduated, I'm talking about the state, graduated from high school, college, and law school. And so you talk about an unfair fight. And so we were very worried. The other thing that his personality was a part of the equation, or added to it, is that he's very quiet. It is very unlike him to speak up for himself, which is probably how he wound up in the situation to begin with, because he was the last one to enter the fray. He was the last one to get involved in the arguments outside. And so we were worried that personality, the inability to speak up for himself, would hurt him on the witness stand. And I think in the end, one of the comments that the jurors made is that watching him testify, what they saw was a gentle giant, because he was double the size of the deceased. He was over 6'3", over 300 pounds. The deceased was, 5'6", 5'5", 140 pounds. I don't think there was any intent to cause his death. He just wanted to stop him and protect his wife and protect himself as well. And the law allows you to do that. And one of the things that's very important and people don't realize in Texas, that you have the right to defend yourself against what's called real and apparent danger. So in other words, the real danger, someone's really got a knife, versus I perceive them to have something or to be reaching for something. It's the same reason when a bank's getting robbed and somebody's got their finger under their jacket, you don't wait to see the gun, you hand over the money. And that's perceived, it's apparent danger. And the law says you have the right to defend against apparent danger to the same extent you do as if the danger had been real. So the fact that he knew all of these things about the deceased completely explained why he perceived him to be armed. And then to see that there is a knife within arm's reach, there was actually real danger as well. The jury was out, I want to say 2.5 hours, 2 hours and 45 minutes, less than 3 hours. It's not a long time for a murder case. It's not necessarily a long time for any kind of case, but especially a murder case, especially when we basically conceded this isn't a whodunit. We're not taking issue with who's responsible. We're not taking issue with the fact that someone passed away as a result of a stab wound. The other thing I would add is that the pathologist, given the wound, could not answer the question, because the testimony was that the deceased lunged at our client's wife and our client. And so one of the questions we asked the pathologist was, can you say whether this injury was caused as a result of the forward momentum of the deceased or the movements of our client, or somewhere in the middle? And he said, I can't answer that. And so those were also issues that they had to work through. But was I surprised? Yes, because we typically know what a verdict buzz sounds like. It's a very strong, long, decisive buzzer. And the first buzzer that they the first time they buzzed, they wanted all the evidence. And the judge sent all the evidence but for the machetes, because there was a couple of machetes that were introduced as evidence. One was the deceased, one involved another of the female out there who threw it over the fence. The judge let the evidence back but for the machetes and the steak knife and the pocket knife. But it was a quick little buzz. Now, the foreman was a female, and so the next time we heard that buzz, it was similar to the first buzz. So we thought, we don't know if they're asking a question. We don't know if they're wanting more evidence. We don't know if they're wanting to go to lunch. Because surprisingly, they went out at around 11:30, which is lunchtime, and they did not ask for lunch. And so when that happens, you're a little cautiously optimistic, because you're thinking, if they find our client guilty, they then have to have a punishment phase where they'll decide punishment. And because they weren't asking for a lunch, it made us think, are they actually going to find him not guilty, which would do away with the second part of the trial? They think that, or at least the majority think that, and that's why they're not asking for a break. The judge read the verdict, and the foreman didn't know exactly what to do. She goes, do I stand? Do I hand the court? The judge goes, hand me the verdict form, and the judge read the verdict. Partly because of the pathologist's testimony, not being able to say really that it was 100% our client's doing that caused the deceased's death. I think partly because the way it all unfolded, murder is a result-oriented crime. So not only do you have to mean the act, but you have to intend the ultimate result, meaning someone's death. Okay? And so that was a big part of our defense as well, is that he never intended the death of his good friend. And so the judge gave the jury manslaughter as a lesser, which basically means somebody did something recklessly and recklessly caused the ultimate result of death, and what's called criminally negligent homicide, which means somebody's grossly negligent and caused someone's death. But the key is that self-defense, regardless, applies to each one of these offenses. And so we focused on, doesn't matter, murder, manslaughter, criminal homicide, it was self-defense. Or defense of another in his wife, and is defending his wife. When a judge reads a verdict, it's like time stands still, because you're listening for every nuance. And the other thing too is, having been a trial lawyer for many, many years, I look at the females when they're filing into the jury box before the verdict is read. And I look to see, are the women holding their purses? Because if they're holding their purses and their thermoses, that means they're done. There's not going to be a second phase. If, however, they're not holding their purses, then they recognize they're going to be going back to the jury room for further work. And so in this case, we had an alternate. So I watched the women file in. They don't have any purses. They don't have their thermoses, and my heart sunk. And then I see one woman come in, and she's got her purse and her thermos, and my heart skips a beat. And then I realize she's the alternate. and she just realizes her duty's done. So they sit down, and I don't tell Kara that I have a superstition about women and their purses. And at that point, I thought maybe they had compromised and found him guilty of criminally negligent homicide. And the judge reads the verdict, and there are actually 3 verdicts, but the first time she just reads not guilty, and she doesn't read murder, not guilty. And so I was thinking, maybe that's it. Like, that's not guilty. And then she goes, not guilty. And then she moves on to manslaughter, and then she goes to the charge of manslaughter, not guilty. And then she moves to criminal homicide, and she says, to this charge, not guilty. And then I was like, you learn not to be emotional in a courtroom, but it was very hard to stop the tears. And my client just began sobbing.